So this is, as Luke called it, Eschatology. John Moore, I think, would pronounce it Eschatology. And John Moore is who's going to be teaching the class, so don't worry. You're going to get a much better experience and learn a lot more from him. But John and Kim are celebrating their anniversary, and that just happened to fall very close to the start of this quarter. And so he asked if I would get things started with the introduction class. And I said, sure. But I thought, oh no. But I think it's going to be a very good study. I'm looking forward to this class. I'm looking forward to this topic. And I think with your all's assistance, today will be a very good class as well. So to begin with, before we really, let's just break this down for a minute. First of all, as we already kind of noted, the word is eschatology. It's not the easiest word to say. It's even harder to spell. And when you have to write it out several times in the course of a lesson, you go, how on earth am I supposed to say or spell this word? It definitely became a tongue twister for me. So if I say it wrong, if I get my words all jumbled up on it today, I've looked at this word 20 million times over the past 2 days, and so it's one of those things where familiarity starts to cause you to go, is that really how you spell that word? I forget what that's called. But we need to know less about how to say it, more about what it means, and especially more about why it's important. And this study is more than just an academic study. It's not just a study that we can look at this and know how to answer people that have views that maybe aren't quite as biblical. It is important for us to know why a study of the end times is vital to our faith, to our identity as Christians. So beginning that, I want to look just for a moment at the actual word eschatology. It comes from 2 words. The first one being eschatos. That is a Greek word which means further or end. You'll see a lot of this in your class notes. And by the way, these class notes, John's going to provide 3 ring binders to fill those out, and he will add more to those as we go along as he kind of builds the curriculum throughout the class. So we're going to be building on that. So keep those, but there'll be more to come. So the word eschatos, meaning further or in the word logos, where we get our word word. And so it quite literally is just words about things further down the line, words about things at the end of something. And so we have rightfully just called eschatology studies of end-time events. What is going to happen at the end of days? What is going to happen? There's different aspects of end-time studies that we might reference a little bit in this class. I'm sure John will cover more as we go through. But what I would like to start off with really is just you all. Why is this topic important to you? And I know we had 2 options for classes that you could be in here at Southside. You could study the book of Proverbs or you could study eschatology. You have chosen to study eschatology. Why? Why does that matter to you? Why is that something of importance? Okay, so as we study through God's Word, this helps us to understand what to expect at the end. That's a great answer. What else? Aaron?
You get a better understanding of the conclusion of God's plan. And He set out a plan before you as a created being. And so the plans are carried out and concluded. It's important to know what the conclusion of that plan is going to be.
Yeah, so we're wanting to study end-time studies so we can get an understanding of the conclusion of the plan of God. Tristan? Yeah. Absolutely. A study of the end times helps us to keep our focus in the right places, helps us to be centered around the right sorts of things and aspects of our life. As Annie said, it's the realization that study of the end times tells us this life isn't the end. There's more. And so it's important for us to keep our focus in the right place. That's a great comment. Anybody else? What does end times mean to you? Why is it important to study that? Yeah, for certain. It helps us flesh out the entire thing instead of just seeing one aspect. Something you hear in the world today is, I believe in God, but not the God of the Old Testament. That God was just a hate-filled, violent, didn't love anybody God. I believe in the God of the New Testament. You can't get a picture of something without seeing the whole aspect of it. And just like with that, end times and eschatology helps us to see the full picture of what God's plan is, what God is doing. So that's a fantastic point as well. So when we deal with studies of the end, when we deal with eschatology, we are dealing with concepts such as fear. The things that cause us fear today. Why do they cause that? Why am I afraid of things that are happening in this life when, kind of to Annie's point, we know that this is not the end. There is something more. Jesus himself talks about don't fear those who can destroy the body, but fear him who destroy the body and the soul. He was bringing up the very concept of end times, that there is more to it. So we're dealing with fear. We're dealing with trust. The trust that we have in God, that He has a plan, that it's got a purpose, it's pointing towards something, and so we're putting our trust in Him. It deals with focus, as was brought up, things that are important, but also with contentment. If this is it, if this is the end of things, if at the end of this life that's it for me and it's over, then it's hard to be content. Because I want to feel as much into that as I can. I'm just trying to completely immerse my life in things, stuff, experience. But if there is a greater life that God has promised waiting for me, that is a life of eternity, a life without sorrow, a life without sickness and illness, if there is something greater at the end, it's going to change the way that I can be content with things, knowing I've got something better coming. So it's dealing with these things. But one thing that I think it deals with most of all, if somebody wants to turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, well, that's weird. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. Whoever gets there first, if you just want to go ahead and read that. God wants us to have hope. He desires His creation. He desires mankind that has been made in His image to have hope. And so for that, to create that, He has done several things. And we can go through the Bible and see many things that give us hope. In Lord's Supper today, we're going to remember something that gives us great hope. But a study of the end times is also something that tells us there is something to hope for. There is a reason for my life. There is a purpose. And so, while in 1 Thessalonians 4 you do not find the word eschatos, you don't find the word logos, you find eschatology in that sentence. God's matter is expressed. He does not want you to be uninformed. He does not want you to feel hopeless. He wants you to understand the extent of His plan, the conclusion of His plan, the purpose in His plan. Your material that John has provided calls that the program of God. Think about at the beginning of a play or some sort of show you go to and they give you the program. This is what to expect throughout the course of this. In God's program, He has provided for us in the Bible. The hope that is produced throughout that, part of that, producing that hope is telling us this is how it's going to end. And this is what it's going to result in. So when it comes to end-time prophecies, a lot of times people are are wanting to know the end. That's part of the reason I think why people try so hard to grow and to learn and to estimate and try to figure out and nail down this is when the end is going to be, because we live in times. I mean, you look at some of the times that these periods have been predicted. People will predict, say, the end is coming soon, we need to get ready, and they start to make those conclusions because what's going on in the world around them? Turmoil, exactly. They look at the world around them and go, this is terrible. During the Great Depression, you saw a rise in predictions of end-time prophecies before World War I, before World War II, as these things ratcheted up. The Vietnam War, around these terrible events in our lives, you see these start to come up. And some of it is because people go to the book, they go to the Bible, they read and see, and they misapply certain principles that this class will deal with more. I think another reason is because they see, this is hopeless. This is terrible. This is not the life that I want. This is not a life that is good. When I look around and see people dying, see people that are so impoverished they can't provide for their families, and sickness is spreading throughout. We see those things, and it causes us to desire something that gives us hope. And so for a lot of people, they want to turn and go, well, what's the Bible say about that? The problem is they do what many of us are tempted to do. Let's just go to the very end and read how it ends, and that'll give us our hope. I don't know how many times that we've maybe had a movie that everybody said, you got to go see this movie, and we just weren't for sure that we wanted to really go and spend money and do that. You say, well, tell me how it ends. Or you read a book, and you just go, well, I'm just going to flip to the very back of it. And you do not get any aspect whatsoever, any idea of what's actually going on. You've got all of these things that have been tied up and wrapped up, all these questions that have been answered, and all you have are the answers, and you don't know the questions. And you don't know how we got here. Don't know why this is supposed to be a happy ending, or is it a sad ending, or what the purpose of any of it is. Very much the same way when we jump to the very end of the Bible and just start trying to pull out all of these meanings without understanding how we got to this point. These are answers to questions that have been asked. What are the questions? And we miss a lot of the concepts. So, if that's true, if we miss what God's Word is providing when we jump to the very end, what are some ways that we can see this more fleshed out as we look through the entirety of His Word? Maybe, can you give me examples of how we see God's end-time revelations throughout the course of the Bible? Is there anything that pop in your head when you think of that? We talked about just a minute ago, 1 Thessalonians 4. It says nothing about what the end will be, but it does tell us God's desires for us to have hope. And that's a part of what He is doing at the end of days. Specifically, it's talking about the end of our days. When we die, we don't want people to grieve as if they don't have hope. So what are some other ways that the Bible reveals end-time understandings throughout its story? Yeah. Yes, for certain. I know that's going to be a big part of any eschatology study, is going to be a study of the book of Daniel and the revelation of end times prophecies, but what are they the end of? And what are they the beginning of? For certain. We have to be able to go in and understand the language that's being used there, and so we can understand other aspects of the Bible as well. That's a great one. What else? Yeah. Yeah, so we see in Daniel specific prophecies that relate to end. We see in Corinthians instruction that reminds us the things that are going on in this life aren't the end of things, that even though we are dealing with hardships, that God is using those to produce something in us, something that is going to be part of our nature in another life, a life that is described as glory We are going from glory to glories. So yeah, we see it there in Corinthian letter. That is, while we might not look at that and say that's a study of the end times, it's God revealing. It's God revealing aspects of the end times that I have a purpose, I have a plan. Part of that plan is for you to be changed, you to be transformed. That's not a physical thing, that's an inward thing. Aaron.
I think of Genesis 3:15.
Yeah.
Put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. You shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think of as well. I mean, we see at the very beginning of the Bible, God creating everything. End of chapter 1, God says, it is good. He looks at it, I see everything good. God has made a place where His creation, specifically mankind, can live in fellowship with Him. He's revealed His purpose in creation is to make a place where Him and man can live together. Something that's interesting, just a side point, this probably won't ever get brought up in the class, and probably rightfully so. Did you realize that when God created everything, He starts naming everything? You see that in the first 2 or 3 days. God creates the expanse and calls it sky. He separates the water from the solid ground and calls it earth. And then that abruptly ends when He starts creating life, plant life, animal life, and then man. What's He immediately do once He creates man? He starts bringing the animals to Him and says, you name them. You give them names. That's what I was doing, and now I'm telling you to carry on my mission. This is my purpose in life. I have a plan in all of this. And Genesis 1:31 tells us it's all good. Genesis 3:4 tells us Satan comes into this. The serpent is in here, and he says, you know what? You can be like God and know the difference between good and evil if you eat of that tree. That's why God doesn't want you to do that, because He doesn't want you like Him. What God has showed us is, I want you exactly like me. I want you to do exactly what I was doing. Create more. Fill the world with my image. So be fruitful and multiply. Create just like I created. Name just like I named. That's my purpose for you. But as you point out, Genesis 3:15, God says because of this wickedness, there's a curse. The world is cursed. I'm going to fight that. I'm going to battle that wickedness, and I'm going to be victorious over it. So yes, at the very beginning of the Bible, we see end-time prophecy. Another one to consider, the very first thing that God does. So, we see Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what you find is God immediately separating two things. What's He separate? The light from the darkness. From the very beginning, God's actions are still revealing to us in time studies. God is of the purpose of creating good and separating light from dark. As we'll see through the rest of the Bible, how that correlates to goodness from wickedness. So what else? Any other thoughts that you all might have on how the Bible reveals end time concepts, prophecies, understandings? Yeah. Absolutely. All of these messianic prophecies, the way that God speaks to David, and then when Jesus comes on the scene, I don't know how you can say, I want to study the end of things without a deep study of the Gospels. The Gospels, over and over again, Jesus is focusing the people that He speaks to. And I'm not talking about physical, I'm not talking about today, I'm not talking about right now. I'm talking about an eternal kingdom that is going to be in the presence of God. Over and over again, Jesus points our minds towards that. So, excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing up Ezekiel. I mean, there is so many aspects of Ezekiel, of battles and of overwhelming floods that are washing people towards this place where God is in the midst. I mean, it's just again and again pictures of what goes all the way back to the beginning, God saying, I'm going to battle and I'm going to be victorious and I'm going to restore this place where the people that I created are in fellowship with me. We're going to be in the paradise again. That's what I'm driving towards. So those are excellent. And going back before even Israel, you see Noah. Noah and the promises and the covenant that God makes with Noah, Abraham, all of these things through Moses and David, they are pointing to God as a God of justice and of wrath. And I think we look at those and kind of overlay them, make them the same, but they're not the same. Justice is filled with compassion. Yes, God is a God of wrath, but He's wrathful because of His compassion that He has for the helpless and for the weak. He shows that again and again in the ways that He responds to the enemies of Israel and to Israel. 9 times out of 10, it's not just Israel, you didn't treat me the way that I wanted to be treated, and this is all about me and my ego and my pride. But more so, it's Israel, you didn't love the way I called you to love. You didn't show compassion. You didn't show mercy. You didn't respect me in what I put you in this position to do. Shine that image of creating good into the world. So over and over again, we see God has a purpose. And God is going to show His justice and His wrath, but also His compassion and His mercy. And that being introduced to the concept of a kingdom, as we mentioned, made without hands, a kingdom that will rise and hold eternal victory, that continues throughout the New Testament. The New Testament brings that around to Christ. And it reminds us, as we get to the close of it, that this Christ is a judge that is returning to bring God's justice and His mercy, but also His wrath. All of this being tied up in the entirety of the story of this of our God. So that kind of goes back to our first question that we asked. Why is this topic important to you? Because this is the entire story of the Bible. From the very beginning, God is saying, I have a plan for the very end of things. That's His plan from the foundation. I'm going to restore the hearts of this creation that have been cursed by their decision to rebel. And I'm going to usher in an eternal relationship and a beautiful place of worship, or of fellowship. To be certain, that means that we need to make sure when we discuss matters of eschatology that we go well beyond just the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, the book of Ezekiel, that we bring those concepts in, but we hold them in the context of the entirety of God's message that He's bringing to us. And part of that brings us then to this idea of understanding. Make sure I have no idea. Oh, yeah, I had another thing to pop up there. God will overcome evil. We covered that already. So part of that means bringing in this understanding of hermeneutics. So who here can tell me what on earth this sentence means? Fetch me a jag of simples, put them in a poke, and bring them here. Somebody was to say that. Is there anybody in the room that has any idea what that sentence means? Poke is a bag, that's right. Where do you know that language from?
My dad is home to use that.
Okay, where's your dad from? West Virginia. Appalachia. Most elderly people from Appalachia will know that language pretty well. Some younger people. Holly's family hails from the Pike County area, Harlan, and some of them still use language like this. Poke was the only of these that I actually knew as well. What this sentence basically means is, go fetch me a small amount of medicinal herbs. So a jag is a small, a pinch of things. Simples was a name for things that you might mix together to make a tincture or some sort of salve, maybe lavender and some oils and things. And a poke is a bag. If somebody was to say it to you today, you're going, I don't know what you want. I'm very confused by this line of reasoning. And by the same example, when we get to the book of Revelation, we need to make sure we understand the words that are being used, the language that's being used. That's what brings up hermeneutics. Who knows what hermeneutics means? That might be another word that's just as foreign to us as Appalachian language. Absolutely. It's a study of words and their interpretation. Yeah, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Are you going to say something else? Okay, yeah, that's absolutely what it is. It's just a study and interpretation of words. That's all, and that's a $15 word for something that we might look at and go, yeah, of course, we need to understand the language of the Bible. When the Bible uses a phrase, does that mean it's the exact same phrase as we use it today? Another example of that might be if we were to write a letter. This has just always been one of my favorite examples. If I was to write a letter to a loved one and say, might be a weird way to say it, but, you know, Uncle Johnny kicked the bucket yesterday. That's what I thought you might want to know. 300 years from now in China, that letter gets discovered and somebody picks it up. They're going to read that and think, Uncle Johnny kicked a bucket. He must have been mad. Was there something in the bucket he was trying to knock over? What's the meaning of this? Very different interpretation. Even though they might be able to read the words, interpretation is completely lost. That's hermeneutics. That's being able to look and to study and see what are these words, what is this phrase, what did this mean in its context? It plays a big part in discovering what the Bible reveals about eschatology. So, in your class stuff, let's look at this. Part C of what was handed out to you. Major hermeneutical issues. It's going to bring up some things that are commonly problems whenever people start thinking about end-time eschatological events. So some of the things that it brings up is, does the second coming of Christ, the resurrection, the judgment of all humanity, and the inauguration of the eternal kingdom occur as aspects of one great event, or are they separated by a temporary messianic kingdom that lasts 1,000 years? We'll hopefully be able to talk a little bit more about that, maybe if we have enough time today, but certainly John will go into greater detail into a lot of the terms that we might have a chance to look at the end. But when people look at the language of the Bible, there's aspects of the Bible that they look at and go, well, that's describing this. And so the end time must look this way. But is that exactly what the Bible is describing? Another one says, are we able to predict when any end time events will occur by paying attention to events transpiring in the Middle East or in other geopolitical occurrences? And what is the role of the church in all of this? These ways of interpreting the language that we see in books like Revelation and books like Daniel, if we haven't spent time studying the words that are being used, how to interpret the words that are being spoken in those passages, what is their context, who were they spoken to, why does it matter, then it's a very real possibility that we will come away from a study such as that with a skewed view that tends to focus more on how we might see things today in 21st century America and what these passages might mean to us today in 21st century America, and miss what the purpose of that passage was to the people it was originally written to. So that's our next question, can you think of other examples? Can you think of examples besides what was just mentioned that describe people who have maybe taken something from Scripture and have read it outside of its context to create a doctrine of end-time fulfillment? The Left Behind series. Yeah, that's actually the rapture. That's the first one that I come to as well. That comes from Luke 17. So let's just flip over and look at that one for a moment. Yeah, I remember this is crazy. I remember the Left Behind series playing. So when I was in elementary school, Mom had to go to work. They would take me, drop me off at the library of the school, and I'd wait for classes to begin before we'd walk off to our first class. I remember sitting in the library of our public elementary school watching the Left Behind series on TV. They were playing it there, which I highly doubt would happen today. But it's a kind of a weird memory that I have. So Luke 17, verses 34 through 36. Now this is in the context, if you have headings in your Bible, you're going to have the heading around verse 22 that says something like, the second coming foretold. And a lot of people take this passage to mean that. And then when they get to these verses, they go, well, what on earth does this mean? So verse 34, I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed, one will be taken, the other will be left. 35, there will be two women grinding at the same place, one will be taken and the other will be left. Now some verses leave out 36, not all manuscripts contain this, but it says two men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other will be left. So, historically, our understanding of the second coming of Christ was a finality, that there would be nothing after that. And yet, when we come to these passages, if we have tried to apply this to the second coming of Christ, we go, well, wait a minute, what about these people that are left behind? How do we figure that out? And so the doctrine of the rapture, fleshed out with passages and illustrations from Revelation, but built primarily off of these verses, is created. What's a problem that you see with that? Is there anything that stands out to you? Maybe even in the same passage that we read? So 37 asks a question. The people that are listening to this, they hear Jesus say all these things, and they go, where? You see, somebody's going to be taken, somebody's going to be left behind. Where, Lord? And he says, where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered. So these people that are left behind, are they left behind to create some sort of society of people that didn't make the first cut and have an opportunity, maybe through a great tribulation, to change and grow, and then when Jesus comes for maybe the third time, they have an opportunity to then be granted entrance into the kingdom? Or are they dead? They're dead. That's Jesus' answer to that, is they're dead. So, if this is referring to the second coming, the people that don't get taken die. But another concept that might be interesting to examine here is whether or not this is discussing a final judgment or Christ coming in judgment in 70 A.D., which much of the language does seem to illustrate that there are going to be those who escape this judgment. There are going to be those who don't. The ones that don't are not going to survive. That is very much the picture that we see when we get to those passages. Again, we're not going to get into that, nor are we going to get into the next one either, really, certainly in this class, Revelation 20, verses 1 through 7. Somebody want to read those passages to us? Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 7.
Now I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the keys of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more till 1,000 years were finished. But these things, after these things, he must be released for a little while. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the witness to Jesus, for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. They lived and reigned with Christ 4,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not live again until 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who is part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests to God and Christ, and shall reign with him in 1,000 years.
All right, so probably the biggest division that you find when it comes to eschatology and studies of end time is what we just read. The Christian world, we'll just kind of use that as in big quotes, those who would claim to be, we are of a Christian faith, there's a lot of division over how do we interpret and how do we apply these verses that we just read. And as I said, we're not going to break that down in this class. John, I'm confident, is going to spend time in this quarter digging into those things and developing a greater understanding of what I believe, I talked with John earlier in the week, what I believe the focus is going to be, how do we accurately interpret these concepts in their context. And that means, how do we interpret them in light of all of the Bible, in light of Scripture? Everything that we've read up to this point, the whole program of God is revealing His plan in the end. So how do we read them in light of the context scripturally, but also how do we read them in light of the context historically? We have to understand that the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel was not written with the intention that I'm going to send this letter to Kyle Blevins in Somerset, Kentucky in the year 2022. No, it was written to people that needed it in that day, in that moment. When we can understand how it applied to them, we can understand how it still applies to us today as well. God intends for us to have an understanding from this. He intends for us to grow and to learn, even learn things that many people would say are mysterious and are hidden. God is saying, I am revealing those things. It's very much the book of Revelation. But it's done in such a way as to mean the same thing throughout the ages. This is God's timeless instruction to say, this is my plan. My plan hasn't changed. It was the plan in the first century to Christians in the first century, and it's the plan in the 20th and 21st century and on throughout life for Christians and for His creation, mankind as well. So, I think we have plenty of time. Let's get into a little bit about why these divisions exist. The reason that we have such divisions in this, it comes back to hermeneutics, but really it's the method that you apply hermeneutics. How is it that you come to study how these words are to be interpreted and come together to provide some sort of meaning to us? So some people apply those things in a very scholarly, they might sit down and say, we're going to dissect everything that's been used and been spoken about to create some sort of academic understanding of this. There are others that look at it and go a very spiritual sort of, maybe this is a philosophy of how things work, and I want to try to apply that philosophy in my life as well. And there's others who just blatantly use fear-mongering to try and gain control of others. And you think, who on earth would do that? David Koresh would do that. If you've ever studied or read, if you remember Waco, Texas, the things that happened there, the Branch Davidians, much of his doctrine was taken from the book of Revelation, from the book of Daniel, and twisted in a way to say, I'm your only hope. You have to believe like me and follow me to find salvation. And it led a lot of people to their death. Certainly there are other things that went on there, not the scope of this, but I want us to see that it creates the way that we study this, our methodology. It has lasting and broad impacts on our lives and even the lives of people around us. There are many different approaches, but there are three things that really affect issues of eschatology. One is the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Some people view this as they are completely divorced from one another. They don't have any relationship. We aren't one of them is kind of like the old God that is full of hate and the new God that is all love. But others ask, should we learn more from one than the other, or should we link them together and try to see that one is trying to explain the other? The way that we answer that question is going to affect the way that we study and interpret the Bible. Also, the way that we look at symbolic language, how we interpret biblical language. Was this language meant to be subjective and therefore had a different meaning to every reader throughout the generation, or did it have an objective meaning to the first recipients that therefore carries over throughout time? And finally, the relationship between Israel and the church. Is the church an afterthought of God? He brought His Messiah into the world. Things didn't go how He planned, so He pulled the Messiah out and put the church in its place, and at some point in the future, He's going to take, we'll try again. The church, is it simply a placeholder? Or is the church the realized source of what Israel was the shadow of? The way that we respond to these questions has a fundamental impact on our interpreting the Bible, and especially the way the language that it uses in regards to eschatology. Now, we are pretty much out of time, but you'll note in your material maybe something as a primer for Wednesday night's class when John is back. There's a lot of terms beginning around, let's see, where did these begin? I guess part D on the back of the second page. Brief definitions of major eschatological terms. And John will get into those a lot more. We need to understand the language that the Bible uses. Whenever it uses that language, what does it mean? Somebody comes to you today and says, what do you think about the Parousia? What's your thoughts on the Parousia? Are you going to go, what? You know, yeah, what does that mean? So we need to understand what that phrase, where that comes from and what language we're using. Another one that is interesting that John had asked me if I was aware of, and I'll just put it out to you, is you've heard maybe of premillennial, postmillennial. Does anyone know the name of what most churches of Christ, most people from the Church of Christ, what they believe on end times, specifically regarding this 1,000-year reign of Jesus? There's a name for that theologically. You can see it up here, so I probably shouldn't have put them all up, but have anybody heard the term or know the term? Is that how it's pronounced? So, when I thought I knew the term until I was talking with John, and he kept calling it all-millennial, and I've called it amillennial my whole life. Kind of like atheist versus theism. An atheist is without a theism. Amillennialism, all-millennialism, the belief that the millennial reign that we read about in Revelation 20 is figurative, is symbolic language. And so if you're talking with someone, they say, well, you're just an all-millennialist. Now you know what they're talking about when they call you that, and they're not wrong if you hold that view. That's the definition or the name for what many churches believe. So thank you guys so much for your input into the class. Really helped to fill and flesh out the time. John will pick it up on Wednesday and really start unlocking some things, I'm sure, better than I have. Thank you guys.